She performed in a dance troupe with JonBenet and took this picture with her at a Christmas party just 1 week before JonBenet was killed.
As a kid, knowing that something horrible had happened and that you don't have an answer, that sticks in your mind.
Brianne Griego and JonBenet both won the Little Miss Colorado crown.
She had just a bright light about her. She was a really nice, fun-loving kid.
The choice to inscribe December 25th, 1996 on JonBenet Ramsey's gravestone stands as one of the most haunting and contentious decisions in this case that has captivated the world for decades. Rather than the official date of December 26th, her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, made a deliberate choice that would forever intertwine their daughter's memory with Christmas Day itself. This decision immediately ignited fierce debate. Was this a symbolic gesture honoring Christmas? Or did it reveal something far more sinister, insider knowledge of when she truly drew her last breath? When confronted in a 1998 interview with Lou Smith and Mike Cain, John Ramsey's words carried the weight of profound grief and startling conviction. "I didn't know for sure," he admitted, "but the note talked about 'we are going to call you tomorrow.' Frankly, her body was cool when I found her. The arms were stiff, and I wanted to tell the world that you ended my daughter's life on Christmas Day. Don't ever forget." These chilling words revealed a father's dual motivation: uncertainty about the precise moment death claimed his child, coupled with an overwhelming desire to brand the world's consciousness with the desecration of Christmas itself. In his book, The Other Side of Suffering, John Ramsey peeled back the layers of this deeply personal decision. "I selected December 25th because I didn't want the world to ever forget what it did to our daughter on the day of joy and peace, Christmas Day." He envisioned strangers decades hence, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, standing before that marker and understanding that the world went mad on that Christmas Day, and someone did this during the peace of Christmas. This was no mere date selection. It was a deliberate act of eternal memorial, forever linking tragedy with what should have been the most sacred of celebrations. The symbolism runs deeper. The presence of Wednesday underwear on JonBenet, who died on a Wednesday, represents more than mere coincidence in this labyrinthine case. This detail suggests that whoever orchestrated the crime scene possessed a particular mindset that sought to infuse meaning into their actions through symbolic elements. The choice appears deliberate rather than random, indicating that the perpetrator was someone who found significance in creating connections between different aspects of the scene. This type of symbolic thinking reveals a psychological profile of an individual who operates with intentionality, seeking to embed layers of meaning even within the context of staging. The decision to include such a specific detail suggests a person who processes events through symbolic frameworks and feels compelled to create meaningful correlations in their actions. What emerges from this symbolic pattern is a chilling portrait of calculated planning that transcends ordinary criminal behavior. In the realm of criminal psychology, such attention to symbolic detail rarely occurs spontaneously in moments of panic or desperation. Instead, it suggests a methodical mind, one capable of maintaining focus on meaningful details even under extreme stress. The Wednesday clothing selection reveals someone who thinks in patterns and connections, who sees significance where others might see randomness. This is not the behavior of a frenzied intruder operating in darkness and terror, but rather someone comfortable enough in their environment to contemplate the deeper meanings of their choices. The symbolic mindset extends beyond mere attention to detail. It reveals a personality type that derives satisfaction from hidden meanings and coded messages. Such individuals often possess what psychologists term symbolic intelligence, the ability to operate on multiple levels of meaning simultaneously. They see connections that others miss, find patterns in chaos, and often believe that their actions carry cosmic significance beyond their immediate impact. This type of thinking is commonly found in individuals who feel misunderstood by society, who believe they possess special knowledge or insight that others lack. Consider the psychological complexity required to maintain symbolic awareness during such a traumatic event. Most individuals in crisis situations experience tunnel vision, their cognitive capacity reduced to basic survival functions. Yet here we see evidence of someone maintaining higher order thinking, processing symbolic associations while simultaneously managing the immediate demands of the situation. This cognitive duality suggests either remarkable emotional detachment or an individual so comfortable with their environment that they could afford to indulge in symbolic flourishes. The Wednesday underwear becomes even more significant when we consider the broader context of the household's emotional dynamics. In families where symbolism and meaning carry special weight, such details might emerge naturally from the psychological landscape of the home itself. If this was indeed staging by someone within the family circle, the symbolic elements might reflect deeply ingrained patterns of thinking, ways of processing reality that had developed over years of family interaction. The attention to such specific details suggests someone intimately familiar with the victim's daily routines and clothing patterns. The symbolic framework also reveals something deeply disturbing about the perpetrator's relationship to the victim. The care taken to ensure symbolic consistency suggests someone who saw JonBenet not merely as a victim, but as a character in a larger narrative they were constructing. This objectification through symbolism indicates a mind capable of abstracting away the human reality of their actions, replacing genuine empathy with intellectual satisfaction at symbolic completion. Such thinking patterns often emerge in individuals who have learned to cope with overwhelming emotions by retreating into abstract conceptual frameworks. Furthermore, the symbolic element suggests someone with a deep need for their actions to be understood and interpreted by others. Random criminal acts require no symbolic consistency, but carefully orchestrated symbolic statements demand an audience capable of recognizing and decoding their meaning. This implies someone who anticipated future scrutiny and wanted their actions to communicate something beyond the immediate crime. The symbols become a form of communication, a way of speaking to investigators and the public through carefully placed clues. The selection of December 25th as the date on JonBenet's gravestone carries profound symbolic weight that extends beyond simple memorial practices. By choosing Christmas Day rather than the officially recognized date of December 26, John Ramsey made a conscious decision to forever link his daughter's death with what should have been a day of celebration and joy. This choice transforms Christmas from a holiday of happiness into an annual reminder of tragedy, creating a permanent association between the sacred celebration and the loss of his child. The symbolic power of this decision lies in its ability to reframe the narrative of her death, positioning it as an event that desecrated not just their family but the very essence of Christmas itself. The date becomes a statement that transcends personal grief, making a broader declaration about how evil can corrupt even the most innocent and joyful occasions. The psychological implications of this date selection reveal layers of meaning that extend far beyond memorial tradition. By claiming Christmas Day, John Ramsey essentially performed an act of symbolic warfare against the very concept of innocence and joy. Every future Christmas would serve as an anniversary of loss, transforming a celebration of birth and hope into a remembrance of death and despair. This represents a fundamental alteration of time itself, a claiming of territory in the collective consciousness that would force others to remember tragedy in their moments of intended happiness. The choice also reflects a sophisticated understanding of memory and cultural impact. Christmas Day is not merely another date on the calendar, it is a cultural touchstone, a day when millions of people across the world share common experiences and emotions. By anchoring his daughter's death to this universally significant date, John Ramsey ensured that her story would never fade into obscurity. The symbolic power of Christmas would forever serve as a vessel for her memory, making her death a part of humanity's collective holiday experience. Furthermore, this date selection reveals a complex relationship with the concept of sacred time. In many religious traditions, Christmas represents the intersection of the divine and mortal realms, a moment when heaven touched earth. By claiming this sacred space for his daughter's death, John Ramsey performed what could be interpreted as either an act of profound faith or profound rebellion. He either elevated her death to the level of sacred significance or he contaminated sacred time with mortal tragedy. Yet something deeply troubling emerges when we examine this insistence on December 25th. The insistence on this date as the moment of death becomes problematic when viewed through the lens of available evidence and timeline analysis. Rather than accepting the more likely scenario that JonBenet died in the early hours of December 26th, there appears to be a deliberate effort to push the timeline backward into Christmas Day itself. This forcing of the timeline raises questions about motivation, as it seems to prioritize symbolic significance over factual accuracy. The decision to maintain this date, despite evidence pointing toward the 26th, suggests that the symbolic meaning of Christmas Day held greater importance than precise factual representation. The arbitrary nature of this choice becomes apparent when considering that there are no compelling evidentiary reasons to definitively place her death on the 25th, making the insistence on this date appear more emotionally or symbolically driven than factually based. The persistence in maintaining this timeline despite contrary evidence suggests something more complex than simple parental grief or memory confusion. When faced with forensic evidence pointing to December 26th, most parents would likely defer to scientific expertise, trusting that professionals could provide more accurate information than their own traumatized recollections. The continued insistence on December 25th, therefore, takes on an almost defiant quality, as if the symbolic importance of the date outweighs any obligation to factual precision. Who is the world? Perhaps most haunting of all is John Ramsey's choice of target for his rage. When he spoke of telling the world that they bore responsibility for his daughter's fate, he revealed a fascinating and deeply troubling psychological framework. John Ramsey's statement about wanting to tell the world that they were responsible for his daughter's death reveals a fascinating psychological approach to processing grief and assigning responsibility. Rather than directing anger toward a specific individual or intruder, he broadened the scope of blame to encompass the entire world, suggesting a worldview that sees collective responsibility for individual tragedies. This perspective reflects a way of thinking that moves beyond specific perpetrators to consider larger forces or entities as responsible for personal loss. The choice to blame the world rather than focusing on finding and confronting the actual perpetrator suggests a different relationship with justice and accountability. It represents a philosophical or spiritual approach to tragedy that seeks meaning in universal rather than individual terms. This expansion of blame to encompass all of humanity reveals a profound shift in how responsibility is conceptualized and distributed. In traditional justice frameworks, accountability follows clear lines from perpetrator to victim, creating straightforward pathways for both investigation and emotional processing. John Ramsey's approach fundamentally disrupts this model, creating a diffuse cloud of responsibility that encompasses every living person. Such thinking often emerges from traumatic experiences so overwhelming that the mind struggles to contain them within conventional frameworks of understanding. The psychological mechanisms underlying this worldview suggest someone grappling with the incomprehensible nature of evil itself. When faced with acts so heinous that they seem to defy human explanation, some individuals expand their conceptual framework to include cosmic or universal forces. This allows them to process experiences that would otherwise shatter their fundamental beliefs about human nature and divine justice. By blaming the world, John Ramsey created a container large enough to hold the magnitude of his anguish. Consider the implications of living with such a worldview on a daily basis. If the entire world bears responsibility for his daughter's fate, then every human interaction becomes tinged with suspicion and blame. Strangers on the street, colleagues at work, friends and family members all become potential participants in the cosmic conspiracy that claimed his child. This perspective transforms ordinary social interactions into reminders of collective guilt, making normal human connection extraordinarily difficult to maintain. The choice to blame humanity as a whole also serves an important psychological function in terms of control and agency. Specific perpetrators can be caught, prosecuted, and punished, providing a sense of closure and justice. But the world itself cannot be held accountable in any meaningful way, creating a permanent state of unresolved grievance. This eternal target for blame ensures that the anger never has to be fully processed or released, allowing it to serve as a continuous connection to the lost child and the trauma of loss. Furthermore, this universal blame serves as a shield against more personal and potentially more painful forms of accountability. If everyone is responsible, then no one bears specific guilt, including those closest to the victim. This diffusion of responsibility can protect family members from confronting uncomfortable questions about their own roles, choices, or potential oversights that might have contributed to the tragedy. But John Ramsey's anguish cannot be understood without examining the devastating pattern that preceded this moment. The pattern of loss in John Ramsey's life, particularly the death of his daughter Beth in 1992, followed by JonBenet's death just 4 years later, creates a context for understanding his approach to blame and responsibility. Having experienced the trauma of losing one daughter and not yet fully recovering from that grief, the second loss appears to have intensified his questioning of divine justice and cosmic fairness. This successive tragedy likely deepened his struggle with spiritual questions about why such events occur to the same family. The comparison to Job's biblical story suggests a man wrestling with faith while being reluctant to directly challenge or blame God for his suffering. Instead of confronting divine responsibility directly, the displacement of blame onto the world becomes a way of expressing anger and seeking answers while maintaining some distance from directly questioning divine justice. The parallel to Job's suffering reveals the theological dimensions of John Ramsey's struggle with responsibility and blame. In the biblical narrative, Job experiences catastrophic losses that test his faith and force him to confront fundamental questions about divine justice and human suffering. Like Job, John Ramsey found himself caught between the need to assign blame for incomprehensible losses and the desire to maintain his spiritual beliefs. The deaths of two daughters created a pattern that demanded explanation, yet traditional frameworks of understanding proved inadequate to contain such overwhelming tragedy. This sequential loss also created a unique psychological burden that compounded the normal grief process. Most parents who lose a child can, over time, begin to view their tragedy as a random and isolated event. But when loss strikes the same family repeatedly, particularly in such devastating circumstances, it becomes much more difficult to maintain belief in randomness or statistical misfortune. The pattern demands explanation, forcing parents to grapple with questions about whether they are somehow cursed, whether they made fundamental mistakes, or whether larger forces are actively working against their family. The 4-year gap between Beth's death and JonBenet's creates another layer of psychological complexity. This time frame represents a period of incomplete healing where the normal grief process was still ongoing when the second tragedy struck. The human psyche requires years to fully process the loss of a child, developing new frameworks for understanding meaning and purpose in life. When this process is interrupted by another comparable loss, it can create a state of psychological overwhelm that makes normal coping mechanisms insufficient. The comparison to Job also highlights the spiritual warfare implicit in John Ramsey's blame framework. In Job's story, his suffering results from a cosmic conflict between divine and demonic forces, making him a battlefield for larger spiritual struggles. By blaming the world for his daughter's fate, John Ramsey implicitly positions his family's tragedy within a similar framework of cosmic conflict, where individual losses serve larger spiritual purposes beyond human comprehension. Like the biblical Job, John Ramsey found himself caught between rage and reverence, between the need to assign blame and the fear of confronting the divine directly. The hesitation to directly blame God for these tragedies, while simultaneously needing to assign responsibility somewhere, creates the psychological space for blaming the world instead. This approach allows for the expression of anger and the need for accountability while avoiding the potentially more challenging spiritual confrontation of questioning divine will or justice directly. The pattern suggests someone who has serious questions about divine fairness but feels uncomfortable or afraid to voice those concerns directly toward God. By directing blame toward the world, there's an implicit acknowledgement of larger forces at work while maintaining a buffer zone that protects against the full weight of spiritual doubt or anger toward divine authority. This approach reflects a complex relationship with faith during extreme grief, where the need to assign blame exists alongside the desire to preserve spiritual beliefs. This careful navigation between blame and faith reveals the intricate psychological balancing act required to maintain spiritual beliefs in the face of overwhelming evidence of divine indifference or cruelty. The displacement of anger onto the world serves as a compromise formation, allowing for the expression of rage while protecting core spiritual beliefs from direct assault. Such psychological maneuvering is common among deeply religious individuals who experience tragedies that challenge their fundamental beliefs about divine benevolence and justice. The choice to blame the world rather than God also reflects an understanding of the social and cultural consequences of different forms of blame. Expressing anger toward the world might generate sympathy and understanding from others, while directly challenging divine justice could result in social isolation and loss of community support. In the aftermath of such devastating losses, maintaining social connections becomes crucial for survival, making the choice of blame target a strategic as well as emotional decision. This framework also provides a mechanism for maintaining hope, despite overwhelming evidence of cosmic injustice. If God is not directly responsible for these tragedies, then divine benevolence remains theoretically possible, preserving the potential for future blessing and meaning. By deflecting blame onto the world, John Ramsey preserved the possibility that his suffering served some larger divine purpose, even if that purpose remained hidden from human understanding. The forensic truth emerges. While John Ramsey fought to claim Christmas Day as the moment his daughter's life ended, forensic science painted a starkly different picture. The forensic evidence and expert analysis consistently point toward JonBenet's death occurring in the early hours of December 26, specifically around 12:30 to 1 a.m., rather than on Christmas Day as claimed. This timeline is supported by multiple factors, including rigor mortis analysis, the condition of the body when found, and expert medical opinion about the progression of the injuries. The evidence suggests that despite John Ramsey's conviction that his daughter died on Christmas night, the actual time of death fell into the early morning hours of the following day. This creates a significant discrepancy between the family's preferred narrative and the scientific evidence available to investigators. The forensic timeline becomes crucial because it establishes a factual framework that must be reconciled with all other aspects of the case. Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner delivered what would become a devastating blow to the family's timeline in his 2015 revelation. Law enforcement believed death occurred around 1 a.m. He further detailed that the squeezing around the head area came 45 minutes to 2 hours after the strike, based on the swelling. While the wound would have eventually caused enough, the squeezing in the upper neck region actually was the final act. Of course, I had to change some of the words for YouTube. This forensic detail places the definitive act that claimed JonBenet's life clearly within December 26, not Christmas Day. The science was unforgiving in its precision, stripping away the symbolic power John Ramsey had tried to claim. The pineapple problem. Central to unraveling this timeline mystery was a seemingly innocent piece of evidence that would prove anything but undigested pineapple found in JonBenet's stomach. This discovery created what investigators would later describe as evidence that throws everything out the window for established timelines. In his 1998 interview, John Ramsey adamantly insisted that JonBenet was sound asleep when he carried her home between 9 o'clock and 9:15 p.m. on December 25th. He couldn't conceive of her eating pineapple after that time without struggle or screaming, especially if an intruder was involved. Yet, if she had indeed consumed pineapple between going to bed and being found, he could only imagine it being at the hands of someone she knew and trusted, even suggesting Santa Claus as a possibility who might have offered a surprise downstairs with pineapple and tea. But if the death occurred around 1 a.m., as forensic evidence suggests, and the family returned home around 10 p.m. with JonBenet being put to bed shortly after, the timeline for an unknown intruder becomes extremely compressed and logistically challenging. The proposed scenario would require an intruder to enter the home, locate and remove JonBenet from her bed, take her downstairs, provide her with pineapple, which she consumed without apparent distress, commit the crime, stage an elaborate scene including writing a lengthy ransom note, and then escape undetected. All of this would need to occur within a window of approximately 3 hours while family members were in the house and potentially moving around. The timeline becomes even more problematic when considering that the staging would have required significant time and preparation, yet the intruder would have needed to complete everything and exit before the family awakened and discovered the ransom note around 5:25 a.m., a convergence of suspicion. What makes this timeline so damning is not just its scientific basis, but the remarkable consensus it has achieved across vastly different investigative communities. The convergence of opinion between Boulder Police Chief Mark Beckner's assessment of a 1 a.m. time of death and similar conclusions reached by independent investigators and web sleuths creates a significant challenge for the intruder theory. When professional law enforcement, with access to all available evidence, reaches the same temporal conclusion as amateur investigators working with limited public information, it suggests that the 1 a.m. timeline is well supported by observable facts. This agreement across different groups with varying levels of access to evidence indicates that the forensic indicators are clear and consistent enough to lead multiple independent parties to the same conclusion. The fact that this timeline creates problems for the family's version of events, while simultaneously being supported by both professional and amateur analysis, strengthens its credibility and raises questions about alternative explanations that don't align with this time frame. John Ramsey himself provided perhaps the most revealing clue when he reportedly told Detective Linda Arndt that this had to be an inside job. In that moment of supposed discovery, did his composed demeanor crack just enough to reveal a truth he couldn't quite suppress? If this was indeed somebody that JonBenet knew and trusted, as he later suggested, the pool of suspects narrows dramatically. The weight of December 25th, in the end, John Ramsey's fight for December 25th, becomes more than a father's grief. It becomes a window into the psychology of loss, blame, and perhaps knowledge. His symbolic choice to forever link his daughter's memory with Christmas Day reveals a complex web of spiritual struggle, timeline manipulation, and the desperate human need to find meaning in senseless tragedy. The gravestone stands as a monument not just to JonBenet's memory, but to the enduring questions that continue to haunt this case. December 25th, 1996. A date that may say more about the living than the dead, more about what someone wanted us to believe than what actually occurred in those dark early hours when a child's life came to an end. The truth may never be legally proven, but the shadows of that truth continue to darken everything they fall upon. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more storytelling analysis like this.